All right, guys, we're going to do a little bit of a fun Q&A here. I got about 5-6 questions lined up and we'll kind of run through them, okay? So question number one, how do you stop early extension? Well, the only way you can possibly stop it is by first understanding what exactly is your early extension trying to accomplish. There are two more common reasons that you will see golfers early extend. The most common would certainly be the club face that gets wide open. When the club face gets open, we can't really rotate and stay in posture because the hands become too passive. You would just hit a lot of pushes, blocks, push fades. It just doesn't really work. We obviously have an intent on where we're trying to hit the golf ball, so our body wouldn't allow us to do that. So a lot of times you'll see golfers release the wrists prematurely in an effort to try to square the club face up. In order to do that, the body has to stall to give the hands time to do it. And when we release the wrists, we also throw the club into the ground. So in order not to hit it heavy as we're doing it, you will see a lot of jumping upwards vertically. So more common reasons would be open club face. The other one would be the shaft coming down way too steep. Early extension is a shallowing mechanism to the club, meaning if I stand here and I have a certain angle of the shaft, and then I push the pelvis forward and my spine extends up, as I do it, I'm actually throwing the club head behind my body. So it's a shallowing move, so your body is doing it in an effort to correct the problem, essentially. So once you correct the problem, once you actually work your way backwards and you figure out what that is, you can correct the problem, then you can work on getting rid of the early extension. Then you can work on keeping the pelvis back, keeping the spine in flexion, creating a lot more rotation, making sure the pressure is moving in the correct way. And it surprisingly becomes really easy to do when you have the variables in the right spots to allow it to happen. All right, question number two would be drills or feels to stop casting and develop shaft lean. It's funny, this kind of relates to the first question. When we are casting, we are trying to square the club face up. What does shaft lean do? Everybody obviously knows that shaft lean, creates compression. That's like the one thing that people talk about. But really what shaft lean does is it takes loft away from the club face, right? So it de-lofts it, but it also actually deflects the club face open. Meaning all else being equal, if I lean the shaft, but I don't actually change my wrist mechanics as I do it, the club face is actually going to point more open. So you need a club face that is much stronger, meaning more closed, because the shaft lean is going to progressively offset that. So the more you lean the shaft, yes, you're taking loft away, but the more you're actually pushing the club face open. So in a situation where you want to try to create shaft lean, first you get the club face in a stronger position, then you're able to actually lean the shaft to square it up. And obviously in order to do that, it requires the right amount of body movements, a lot of weight transfer and transition, a lot of rotation of the body. You combine those things at the correct sequence and you can actually create more shaft lean. Believe it or not, it's very rare that I'll just get a player to kind of shove the hands forward to try to create lean to the shaft, because oftentimes you're just going to create a handle drag. You're going to create too much narrowness to the wrist angles. It's not really ideal. The most efficient way of doing it is actually changing the way the body moves first and then worrying about delaying the release pattern a little bit if necessary. But it's very rare that I'll just tell a player to kind of like push the hands towards the target on their own, like in isolation, in an effort to try to create shaft lean. So first to get the club face in a stronger position, then work on the sequence and the body movements, and you'll be able to get there pretty quickly. All right, question number three is any tips to hit up on the driver more? Now, I will say the biggest mistake that people make in this scenario, in my opinion, is that they're very one-dimensional with their approach. So what does that mean? It means that everybody does the same thing, which is like they throw the ball position way forward, they tilt their upper body away from the target, and then in the downswing, they're trying to keep their chest and their head behind the ball to try to hit up on it. Now, there's going to be a large grouping of people that are actually going to benefit from this information. I'm not saying it's bad necessarily. I'm just saying it's very one-dimensional. It's a one-approach method to try to actually correct your problem, where the reality is that golf swings are very subjective. And in order to change it, you can actually hit up on the ball more without necessarily needing to band-aid your swing through setup adjustments. For example, if there is a golfer who is lacking in hand depth, getting the hands deeper actually pushes the club path obviously more from the inside, but it typically will also shallow your attack angle. So if you're somebody who can benefit not only from actually hitting more up on the ball, but actually swinging more from the inside, believe it or not, making an adjustment in your arm plane at the top of your backswing would actually be a much more efficient approach than just band-aiding your swing through your setup through tilt and ball position. Believe it or not, the more you move the ball forward in your stance, of course, it does help you to hit up on the ball, but it actually makes your path work more from the outside. If you're somebody who's already hitting a lot of pulls and fades, that's only going to amplify that problem, even if theoretically you're hitting up on the ball more. So the reason why I say like I'm not crazy about the one-dimensional approach is just because swings are very subjective. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. Of course, if we close off our alignment, for example, it'll help us to swing more from the inside while also allowing us to hit up on the ball more. You know, there are setup changes that influence the attack angle and the path and stuff very, very differently. So the best advice I can actually give you in this situation is very simply to go see a professional to find out what the best and most efficient method is for you. You know, of course, that one-dimensional approach can help. I don't necessarily think it's for everybody, though. Okay, question number 4. Is there a rule of thumb for what the dynamic loft of a 7-iron should be at impact? This is one of the questions that I got in my Instagram story about a week or two ago. I said I was going to dive into this further. So for those of you who don't understand what that question means, dynamic loft essentially just means the loft at impact. Whenever you see a metric on like a launch monitor and it says dynamic with the metric, it basically is referring to what that number represents at the moment of the strike, at the moment of impact. So dynamic loft means the loft that the club face has at the moment of impact. Static loft would be just the loft of the club face, you know, at the start of the golf swing, or just in terms of the way the equipment was built. So is there a rule of thumb for what the dynamic loft of a 7-iron should be? Not necessarily, and I kind of said this in the story as well. You know, the truth is you can have 3 different golfers who can benefit from 3 different types of dynamic lofts. They could be 24, 27, and 30, for example, or 21, 24, and 30. The reason why I say this is because we have to understand what loft does to the golf ball. Everybody thinks that creating more shaft lean, more compression is really beneficial, and of course that is true. But there is a point of diminishing returns where if you actually create too much shaft lean and you take too much loft away from the club face, if you're not somebody who swings very fast, you might actually get that ball to die out of the sky. That's why I say that everybody has a very different number that benefits them specifically. A high speed player needs less dynamic loft. The reason being is because the faster you swing, the more speed you put on the golf ball, the more spin you're going to put on the golf ball, the more the golf ball is going to want to get airborne. So speed is really good for getting the ball in the air, but of course that comes with more spin. The way to neutralize that effect for a high-speed player is by creating more shaft lean. So a faster player would typically want to have less dynamic loft at impact. If you are somebody who is a much slower player, whether you get older or you're limited in your range of motion or you're just not a fast swinger of the club in general, right? Well, then having a lot of shaft lean can actually be a negative, because now already being a slower player, you might not put a lot of spin on the golf ball. If you create too much shaft lean, you're going to take even more spin away from the golf ball. When you remove loft, that ball might not get airborne enough. And obviously being a lot lower spin, it doesn't carry as far and it rolls out a lot more. That's a much more unpredictable ball flight. So there comes a point where it is a diminishing return. You basically, the slower you swing it, the more loft you actually want to have at impact to help you get the ball up in the air and add some spin, because you are somebody who's not putting a lot of spin on the ball naturally through your swing speed. So believe it or not, that number varies quite a bit. The faster you swing, the more shaft lean you can afford to have. The slower you swing, the less shaft lean you theoretically would want to have. And then last question, number 5, how do you handle body limitations within the golf swing? So of course, there are certain people who either have had major surgeries, again, or are just limited in what their certain mobility is within a certain body part. Of course, in that scenario, you have to work with what the golfer is giving you. So for example, if somebody cannot really rotate very well, they have limitations within their hip joints or limitations within their shoulder joints, and they can't create a big rotation of the chest. In many scenarios, that typically means that the harder it is to rotate around your body, the harder you're going to be, or the more difficult time you're going to have to try to shallow the club and swing from the inside. Because if I stand here, for example, and I make a big turn to my body, the more rotation I'm adding in my backswing, the deeper I'm getting my hand path, the more from the inside I'll swing. If I'm somebody who's limited in my rotation of my body, it's going to be very hard for me to actually get my hands in a deep enough position without just like shoving them across my chest. I might be a little bit of a steeper player coming into the ball. Now, either you can find other ways to shallow the club for that particular pattern, meaning you can really band-aid the setup by closing it off a lot or moving the ball position a little bit more back to help them swing from the inside. Or you can just be a steeper player who doesn't quite rotate very well in the backswing, but also doesn't quite rotate very well in the downswing, and they rely a little bit more on their arm structure to make the golf swing work, which sometimes that is the most efficient way for that player to get around the golf course. But of course, handling body limitations is not impossible. It just means you have to work within what the player can give you. So there are ways to band-aid swings through setup, ball position, club alignments, body alignments, and things like that. And then, of course, there are certain ways to make changes within the golf swing. For example, if I'm not somebody who has a lot of external rotational capability on my trail shoulder joint, I can't use that to shallow the club. It doesn't mean I can't change my wrist angles, change the forearm rotation, or do something else to shallow the club, like changing my hand depth, where I don't necessarily need to have this trail shoulder very externally rotated. There's a lot of different ways to work around it. So again, it's not a death sentence if you don't have a lot of range of motion or freedom of motion within your body. We just have to work with what you're able to give us.